Ah, look who just became a case file, welcome back. Not because you asked to be noticed, not because you demanded attention, but because something about you no longer fits the story they had prepared. You feel it, don't you? That pause when you enter a space. That subtle recalibration when people look at you a second longer than necessary. That quiet moment where they're trying to place you and failing. This is what happens when someone survives something that was supposed to reduce them. This is what happens when pressure doesn't flatten you, but reorganizes you. They're revisiting old moments now, replaying conversations in their minds, scrolling back through memories, interactions, assumptions, trying to figure out when it changed, trying to locate the exact point where the version of you they understood stopped existing, and they can't find it because there was no single dramatic moment, no announcement, no collapse they could witness, no public transformation they could track in real time. You didn't evolve loudly, you evolved privately. You disappeared into the kind of silence most people mistake for weakness, the kind of quiet that makes others underestimate what's happening beneath the surface, while they assumed you were processing, healing, licking wounds, trying to get back to normal. You were rewriting your internal structure. You weren't breaking, you were shedding reactions, shedding explanations, shedding the instinct to prove yourself to people who never intended to understand you. That's what unsettles them now. Not that you changed, but that you changed without asking for permission. They expected predictable outcomes. They expected bitterness. They expected visible damage. They expected you to perform your pain so they could categorize it and move on. Instead, you did something that doesn't fit their mental models you observed. You watched what pressure revealed in others. You noticed who stayed comfortable only when you stayed small. You learned who needed you confused so they could feel certain. You paid attention to how easily support evaporated when your growth disrupted familiar dynamics. And you didn't react the way you used to. You didn't explain yourself into exhaustion. You didn't argue your reality into legitimacy. You didn't collapse into the roles they expected you to play. You went quiet, not the silence of avoidance, the silence of alignment. That's when the rules stopped working. Guilt stopped landing. Shame lost its leverage. Fear stopped being an effective motivator. Validation stopped being currency. And when someone no longer responds to the usual pressures, people get nervous because systems, social, emotional, cultural, depend on predictability. You became difficult to predict, not erratic, not chaotic, just independent. They're calling it confusing now. They are saying you're different, unreachable, hard to read. What they really mean is this: you no longer mirror their expectations back to them. You don't rush to reassure. You don't over-explain your boundaries. You don't perform accessibility to make others comfortable. You listen. You choose. You move with intention, and that kind of presence feels disruptive to people who are used to emotional access without accountability. They're trying to analyze you through old frameworks, old labels, old versions of you that no longer apply, but those frameworks were built for someone who needed approval, for someone who negotiated their worth, for someone who explained themselves into exhaustion. That person didn't survive what you survived. The pressure refined you. It taught you the difference between attention and care, between proximity and loyalty, between noise and truth. You learned that not every reaction deserves a response. Not every misunderstanding deserves correction. Not every invitation deserves acceptance. You learned that restraint is not absence, it's choice now. When people look at you, they sense something they can't name, a steadiness that doesn't ask to be validated, a calm that doesn't need to dominate to feel powerful, a presence that doesn't bend itself to fit old dynamics. That's why they're unsettled, because you didn't replace one mask with another. You removed the need for masks entirely. They're asking questions now, quiet ones, internal ones. What happened to them? Why don't they react anymore? Why doesn't the old leverage work? Some are curious, some are threatened, some are suddenly reflective in ways they weren't before. Because your existence is forcing comparison. And comparison is uncomfortable when someone chooses growth without spectacle. You're not trying to influence anyone, but influence happens anyway, because when someone opts out of performance, it exposes how much of the world is built on it. When someone stops chasing validation, it highlights how many people are still running. When someone chooses clarity over chaos, it makes chaos visible. That's the part they can't articulate. You didn't become louder, you became clearer. And clarity is disorienting to those who rely on ambiguity to maintain control. They're adjusting now, rewriting how they interact with you, watching their tone, choosing their words more carefully, not because you demanded respect, but because your boundaries no longer require explanation. You don't argue your limits. You enforce them through consistency. You don't threaten. You withdraw, access, and withdraw. When it's calm and intentional, carries more weight than confrontation ever could. Some people are trying to reconnect. Others are pretending they always saw this coming. A few are quietly distancing themselves, unsure how to relate to someone who no longer plays the same game. You notice all of it, but you don't chase clarity from people who benefit from confusion. You don't seek closure from those who only offer it on their terms. You don't correct narratives that no longer define you. You let them sit with the uncertainty. Because you've already made peace with not being understood by everyone. You understand yourself now. You know what you can tolerate. You know what you won't. You know the difference between solitude and loneliness. You know the cost of your silence and its value. That knowledge didn't come from comfort. It came from endurance, from staying present when it would have been easier to disappear, from choosing awareness when numbness was an option, from sitting with questions that didn't have immediate answers. That's why this version of you feels heavier, not burdened, grounded. You're not carrying more. You're carrying what matters. And as people continue to study the change, as they replay old moments, reframe old interactions, search for explanations that fit their worldview, they'll eventually realize something unsettling. You didn't change to oppose them. You changed to align with yourself, and alignment doesn't announce itself. It simply alters gravity. Conversations shift, dynamics adjust, expectations fall apart. Not because you force them to, but because they no longer apply. You keep moving quietly, intentionally, not finished, not complete, just no longer available for the version of the world that required you to stay fragmented. And somewhere behind you, the old frameworks are still recalibrating, still trying to understand, still adjusting to the fact that what they're observing isn't an error. It's evolution in progress. And here's the part. No one tells you about becoming unreadable. Once the noise dies down, once the speculation burns through its own oxygen, what remains isn't applause or recognition. It's space. A wide, unfamiliar quiet where you finally hear your own thoughts without interference. Where your decisions no longer echo with borrowed voices, where the urgency to be seen dissolves into the certainty of being aligned. This is where the real shift happens, because while others are still trying to interpret you, still revisiting old assumptions, still adjusting their language around you, you're no longer standing still long enough to be defined. You've moved past reaction. You don't correct misunderstandings unless they matter. You don't clarify intentions unless clarity serves you. You don't chase alignment with people who only understand you when you're convenient. That restraint confuses people who equate presence with accessibility. They mistake your calm for distance, your boundaries for detachment, your discernment for coldness, but you know the difference. You've learned that availability is not the same as connection, that proximity does not guarantee safety, that explaining yourself endlessly is not the same as being understood. So you choose differently now. You let people reveal how deeply they're willing to engage without prompting. You watch who respects silence instead of trying to fill it. You notice who adjusts their behavior rather than their excuses. And you don't rush the process, because patience is no longer something you use to endure discomfort. It's something you use to gather information. This is where your power actually lives, not in how others perceive you, but in how little their confusion dictates your movement. There's a subtle confidence that grows when you stop negotiating your inner reality, when you trust your observations more than outside interpretations, when you realize that most people aren't reacting to you at all. They're reacting to what you represent. And what you represent is unsettling. You are evidence that pressure doesn't have to destroy, that silence can be chosen, not imposed. That identity is not something you defend, but something you inhabit. You didn't escape the system by rebelling against it. You simply stopped feeding it the data it needed to predict you. And without prediction, control weakens. People feel that instinctively. That's why conversations around you have shifted, why some people hesitate before speaking, why others suddenly over-explain themselves. They're adjusting to a presence that no longer mirrors their expectations back to them. You've become reflective without being reactive, observant without being exposed, engaged without being entangled. And that balance is rare. It makes some people curious. It makes others uncomfortable. It makes a few quietly self-aware in ways they didn't expect. Because your stillness invites comparison, not the loud kind, the internal kind, the kind that asks questions people aren't ready to answer about their own lives, their own choices, their own compromises. You don't force those questions, you don't suggest them, you don't point them out. You simply exist as someone who already asked them and lived with the answers. That's why your presence lingers after you leave a room. Why people replay interactions with you later, searching for what felt different. Why they remember what you didn't say more clearly than what you did. You're no longer trying to be impactful. You're intentional, and intention has weight. It shapes how you move through time, how you invest your energy, how you decide what deserves your attention. You don't rush connections anymore. You don't force alignment. You don't mistake intensity for depth. You've learned to recognize the difference between people who are intrigued by your evolution and those who are threatened by it. The first group listens. The second interrogates. The first grows quieter around you, more thoughtful. The second grows louder, more performative. And you don't argue with either. You let patterns speak for themselves. That's another thing you learned under pressure. Truth doesn't need volume to be real. It needs consistency. So you keep showing up the same way, measured, clear, grounded, not rigid, not closed, just no longer scattered, and slowly the world around you reorganizes. Not because you demand change, but because people adjust themselves in response to what they can no longer move. Some step closer with respect, some fall away without drama. Some linger at the edges, unsure how to relate to someone who doesn't need their approval. You let them because you've stopped needing closure from every interaction. You understand now that not everything resolves into understanding. Some things simply reach the end of their relevance, and that's enough. There's a deeper ease that comes with this phase, a steadiness that doesn't spike or crash, a sense of direction that isn't rushed by comparison. You're not in a hurry to arrive anywhere. You're building something internal that doesn't collapse under observation. That's why even when attention returns, when curiosity resurfaces, when people circle back with new questions, you don't feel pulled, you decide, and decision. When it's calm is unmistakable. This is the part of evolution that doesn't photograph well. That doesn't trend. That doesn't translate into sound bites. But it changes everything. Because you're no longer waiting for life to feel stable before moving forward. You've learned to carry stability with you. You don't outsource certainty. You don't borrow confidence. You don't look for permission to trust what you already know. You act from alignment, not reaction, and that alignment continues to deepen. Not dramatically, quietly, through choices no one applauds, through boundaries no one negotiates, through consistency no one notices until it's undeniable. You're still becoming, still refining, still adjusting. But now the process belongs to you, and somewhere behind you, people are still trying to update their understanding, still reviewing old impressions, still catching up to a version of you that no longer waits to be interpreted. You don't turn around to correct them. You keep moving, not faster, just forward. Because the case they think they're studying isn't static, it's alive, evolving, and no longer shaped by the frameworks that once defined it. And that, whether they realize it yet or not, is something they'll be adjusting to for a long time.